Hello and welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Media. I am your sometimes host, Emily, and today we are going to be talking about A Complete Unknown, the new movie starring Timothée Chalamet and Edward Norton and various other wonderful famous people that is all about Bob Dylan. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Bob Dylan, somehow he was a very influential sort of folk rock artist who, got his start in the 60s and has continued making music for a long time. I still don't think that he's technically retired. And he's made some very influential music, so a biopic about him was kind of inevitable at one point or another. And this year, the director behind the movie Walk the Line decided to come back and do another biopic about a super influential musician in the form of A Complete Unknown. So before I get into what I liked about this movie, what I didn't like about this movie, and where I feel it's going for the Oscars, I do just want to sort of give a disclaimer to anyone who's potentially interested in watching this movie, to sort of set expectations, because this is something that I knew going in, but the people I saw the movie with didn't, and they were a little bit frustrated by it, but I wasn't because I kind of knew the deal. This movie only covers the first 4-ish years of Bob Dylan's career. This is not a life-spanning biopic that is going to cover all the 20 some odd albums that he's released. It's not anything like that. This is a movie that specifically wants to cover Dylan's entrance into the folk music scene up until him playing electric guitar at a folk music festival and sort of breaking down the sort of industry of folk music. So why I say that this is important is because the movie, if you don't go into it with that understanding of it being about how Dylan got into the industry and then sort of broke the industry, you will be very confused and feel like there's not a lot of a story. Bob Dylan, as just a guy, is very mysterious. He hasn't really talked a lot about his past before being a recording artist. There's a lot of stuff that we don't know about him. He kind of insists in interviews that all of his songs are fictional, but there's been debate about whether some of his songs are autobiographical. Dylan is a difficult subject to make a biopic about purely because there just isn't a lot of information about him out there. And for what it's worth, I actually think the film commits a lot to preserving the mystique of Dylan's sort of persona. Characters in the film itself are often confused about how much of his music is about him versus how much of it is just stories that he comes up with. They very much preserve the mystique of Dylan's character. And while I appreciate that, it can make for a frustrating viewing experience if you are going into this film expecting it to be like a tell-all about Dylan's life. It's not that, so kind of set the target at it being something completely different. Because what I do think it does is tell a story about a changing period in music and in history very, very well, while using sort of Dylan as the focus. And to that end, I'm going to talk about what I thought this movie did very well. First and foremost among that, like many other movies this year, I think the acting in this film is phenomenal. Timothée Chalamet does an excellent job playing Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is a guy with a very unique speaking pattern. Max, if you want to insert a clip of Bob Dylan talking here.
Yeah, I won't be able to talk to you afterwards. I got nothing to say about these things I write. I mean, I just write them. I don't need to say anything about them. I don't write them for any reason. There's no great message. I mean, if you want to tell other people that, go ahead and tell them.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Nice
Great to see you.
How you doing? We made around the world in 80 days, huh?
It's a magic carpet ride. Just full of wonder. Full of wonder.
This is Becca, by the way.
Chalamet kind of takes the way that Dylan acts and talks and his whole vibe and just runs with it. And he really commits to selling it to the point where, for such a high-profile actor, there were scenes where I forgot it was Chalamet and just kind of got swept up in the Bob Dylan of it all. And he also covers a fair number of Bob Dylan's songs throughout this movie. And for what it's worth, I think he does a pretty bang-up job covering those songs. Dylan's vocals are not easy to imitate. He has a very outstanding and unique voice. So I commend Chalamet for not just doing the ADR approach where they play Bob Dylan's vocals over his lip syncing and actually covering the songs. He does great versions, and I actually really like some of the versions of the songs that he covers for this film. On that note, if we have any Bob Dylan fans in the audience, I do also want to clarify, if you go into this movie expecting to hear songs that were released after 1965, you will not, because that is when the movie ends. So again, that's just an expectation to set, because a lot of Dylan's most sort of famous work, right? Blood on the Tracks was a really huge album, but that music from that era and like later in his career just simply isn't featured in this movie, because why would it be? It's about the beginning of his career. So that was an interesting choice, and certainly a bold one. When you're making a biopic about a musician, it's very tempting to try to capitalize on all of their like most well-known songs. And so the fact that this movie is so committed to telling the story that it wants to tell, that even it is like, yeah, we will sort of not cash in on some of Dylan's bigger songs from later in his career because they just aren't appropriate to the era of his life that we're trying to tell, I think makes sense. And I think it was actually a smart choice from a writing perspective to try to cover this portion of Dylan's career, because it's a lot more clean cut in terms of the history of it and like the documentation of it than some of the other inflection points in Dylan's career. Specifically thinking about Blood on the Tracks, which was an album that it is heavily speculated, and in my opinion, probably true, that he wrote that album about his crumbling marriage and relationship with his kid. But he still insists that all of those songs are fiction, that they're all just stuff that he made up, and any resemblance to his actual personal life is like coincidental. So for other periods of Dylan's life, it would be much harder to make a film about them. Whereas what this movie is trying to tell, because it is about the larger context that he existed in as an artist, it is a little bit easier and more straightforward to tell that story. But yeah, the acting is fantastic. Chalamet commits to a very difficult character. And I also want to call out Edward Norton, who is an actor that, despite his occasional buffoonery on set, I do think is an absolutely stellar performer, and this movie is no exception. He does fantastic as Pete Seeger, singer of Union songs and all that good stuff, playing sort of a folk institutionalist who cares about Bob in a lot of ways, but also cares about the institution of folk music and like the sort of history and tradition of folk music. And so it's very interesting to see him going from like Bob Dylan's number one supporter to being very conflicted about the fact that it's like this person who I love and who I sort of helped elevate the career of is now challenging everything that I thought we communally held dear. It's a very complicated character and certainly not an easy one to play. And Norton just full sells it like he does in any other role. He is absolutely stellar, and I have like no notes about his performance. He's utterly brilliant. But beyond that, this movie does a lot of other things that are great. Again, I appreciate how much it's committed to documenting this period of history. There are several scenes that follow Dylan through pretty significant historical events. The Cuban Missile Crisis, I believe, happens at one point in this movie, and there's a whole scene of Chalamet as Dylan playing Masters of War in a bar that's extremely well done. There are a lot of scenes of musical performance that have a lot of intricacies that are really fascinating to watch, specifically capturing the relationship between Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, who had a fraught and tumultuous affair, of which Bob Dylan kind of comes out of it looking like an asshole, because frankly, he kind of was an asshole. Right. But I think what's really interesting to watch is that the movie manages to communicate some of that complexity between Baez and Dylan in scenes where they're performing together, specifically while they're like performing the music, which I'm sure was ADR'd, but it's still impressive that while they're not actually speaking to each other, just through like eye contact and the framing of shots, you can sort of get the emotional state that those people are in when they're performing. It's really impressive filmmaking. I was impressed how emotionally gripping they were able to make scenes of performing songs that we had already heard prior to that point in the movie. So that was all excellent. Because it's the director of Walk the Line and he couldn't resist, the Johnny Cash does feature in a couple of scenes in this movie, not played by Joaquin Phoenix, because I presume he would have been too expensive, / too hard to like nail down for a role that's not that huge in this film. But Johnny Cash is there and provides some really interesting scenes. One of my favorite sequences in the film is towards the end. There's a conversation between Bob and Johnny that is really interesting to listen to. It kind of shows this moment where Dylan sort of commits in his mind to changing, to being the next thing as opposed to the last thing. And how Johnny Cash sort of talks to him about that and reacts to that. And it's all very impressively done. That is this movie's strength to me, is its writing and a number of its scenes that communicate such interesting dynamics, such interesting pieces of history, and how the people in the music industry were reacting to the world that they were living in a pretty chaotic period of life to be living in America. I mean, we've seen movies in the past couple of years that have kind of gone back to the sort of nuclear and Cold War type of era to talk about what living in those times of uncertainty felt like because of current political situations, which I'm not going to use this review to comment on, but when you look at movies like White Noise, when you look at movies like Oppenheimer, there's sort of a fascination with the nuclear bomb and its effects throughout the 20th century, like the latter half of the 20th century, right? Because it kind of echoes this uncertainty that we live in now. And I think that the movie really takes an intentional step to capture the tumultuous politics of the 60s, because Dylan as a person was also, I mean, I guess he's still alive, still does things, was sort of enwrapped in radical politics of the time. He was enwrapped in activism, because folk music is enwrapped in activism. It always has been. And I think the movie does a really smart thing of showing that by having Pete Seeger, played by Ed Norton. The movie literally opens with him facing trial for being I don't even remember what they worded as, but treason, I think, or because they claim that This Land is Our Land. The song that he wrote was promoting communist values. So the movie kind of starts off on that note of these are people who by our standards might not necessarily be revolutionary or have the modern sensibility of revolutionary ideals, but for the time they certainly did. They were certainly challenging a lot of preconceived notions about what was acceptable at that period in time. And I like that the changing period of history, the way that the world was changing at the time, is reflected in the way that the music industry is also shown to be changing at the time, with people fighting against change, right? Specifically folk music institutionalists who are battling the changing tide of the world. They're trying to resist moving forward, because moving forward means abandoning this institution that has unified people in a time where people weren't necessarily that unified in this country. And I think framing folk traditionalism as clinging to a sense of unity that they fear will be lost if they move forward is a really fascinating look at that sort of industry level conservation effort, and showing Dylan as someone who, regardless of its effect, wanted to pioneer. He wanted to make something new and something different. And showing that in the way that they do in the film is really excellent. It's super well done. I really appreciated it. Obviously, if you can't tell, I'm a person who has an interest in folk music as an industry. I'm a person, I listen to a lot of folk music. I love Bob Dylan. So this movie really stood out to me on that level, because it has so much to say about music as sort of a piece of context in the larger world that was surrounding it. But beyond that, there's still a lot to love in this film. It's excellently shot. The music is excellently covered. There are even some covers of Joan Baez songs and Johnny Cash songs and Pete Seeger songs done by all of the actors and actresses involved there. Monica Barbero also plays Joan Baez in this film and does an excellent job. Her voice is incredible. We've had a lot of music themed movies this year, but for my money, it's between Monica Barbaro and Cynthia Erivo for the most impressed I have been with a vocalist in a film this year. She does these totally crazy notes and all that kind of stuff. And hearing her and Chalamet sing together is absolutely fantastic. Again, a lot of why I think this movie holds an appeal and a lot of why I liked it is just because I love those songs. The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan has so many good songs on it, and that is the album that the majority of the songs in this movie come from. So that was really cool to see. And it kind of goes up to Highway 61 Revisited, which is also super influential album. I could probably talk for a while about the impact of Highway 61 Revisited, but I won't. Ultimately, if you have an interest in music, or if you have an interest in the 60s as a time period and what people were going through in that time, I think you will find a lot to like in this movie. I know I did, as a person with an interest in both of those things. But even if you're not necessarily interested and you just want to see good ass acting in a biopic, you could definitely do a lot worse than this. In terms of music biopics that have been nominated or are going to be nominated for Oscars, you could do a lot worse than this film. Moving on, I'm going to talk about where I see this movie's route to the Oscars and Best Picture. So one of the strongest things that I think is propping this movie up for a Best Picture nomination is going to be the acting sort of segment of the Academy. I definitely foresee a Best Leading Actor nomination for Chalamet, which is very funny because he's been in 2 of what I suspect will be the 10 Best Picture nominees this year. And he's being nominated for this one, which is fair. He was great as Paul Atreides, but I think this is the better performance of the 2. I also think supporting actor for Ed Norton is certainly not off the table. Supporting actor is a pretty rough category because everyone's going up against Kieran Culkin for A Real Pain, who is pretty much a showstopper. I don't see a world where any of them beat him, but Edward Norton certainly is going to clinch a nomination, or at least I'm almost certain that he's going to clinch a nomination. Beyond that, a couple of technical awards. I think sound is a pretty solid one just because of the mixing on the music and the way that all of it's done is really excellent. Monica Barbaro for supporting actress would certainly make me happy. I think she deserves it, but I don't necessarily know if it'll happen. I will certainly be happy if it does. I would love to see her there against some of the other nominees. But like I said, acting is going to be this movie's sort of biggest supporting area, I think, and the actors portion of the Academy is a fairly large one, so I think it may be able to clinch the nomination on that alone. But with some of the sound and technical awards thrown in there, I think this movie has a real shot at a lot of these awards. It's also competing in the adapted screenplay category, given that it's adapted from both a guy's life and a book about said guy's life that's called How Dylan Went Electric. So if you're interested in more information about the stuff that's shown in this movie, you can definitely go seek out that book, and it tells a little bit more of the story about this time period. But the adapted screenplay category is pretty messy this year. I've mentioned it in other reviews, but it is a really hard category to be competing in. And while I'm hoping that Complete Unknown does well, I certainly think it will get a nomination over certain other films. I have a hard time foreseeing a universe where Wicked, for example, necessarily gets a screenplay nomination, purely because it is it's so ingrained in its source, and screenplay was not necessarily that movie's excelling feature anyways. I don't necessarily see Wicked or anything getting that nomination, but I certainly foresee it for Complete Unknown, just for the way that it integrates the time period and what it's talking about into this sort of micro level examination of the music industry. All in all, I definitely recommend A Complete Unknown, especially if you have an interest in its subject matter. If you have no pre-existing interest in this movie's topic, you're probably going to be hard-pressed to enjoy it, which is fine. Not every movie is for everyone, but I certainly enjoyed this movie a lot. I think there's a lot to like here. And also, if you're just a person who finds Timothée Chalamet hot, he takes off his shirt sometimes in this movie. So if that's an appeal, fucking go for it. But ultimately, yeah, I like this movie and I would definitely recommend it. So thank you for watching. We appreciate your viewership time and time again. If you want to hear more videos like this, definitely subscribe. We have a really big year for content coming up, and I think you guys are going to like a lot of what we have in store. So definitely keep an eye out for stuff coming on the horizon. Like this video if you want to see more content like this, if you want to see more content like what else we make on this channel. All of the interaction that you guys give means a lot, so we'd really appreciate it. Like and subscribe and share this video with the biggest Bob Dylan fan in your life. If I had to guess, it's probably your parents, but who knows. At any rate, have a good one, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.